This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest is Tony Thompson, author of The Doors' Every Album, Every Song. The Doors remain one of the most original acts in the history of rock and roll, but their actual music is sometimes overshadowed by the cult of Jim Morrison. Those with long memories will recall a point in the 1980s when he went from lead singer of an old band to a signifier of cool, known as Morrison. His image appeared everywhere on t-shirts, posters, and in the film The Lost Boys, adorning a wall in Keifer Sutherland's Vampire Cave. A biopic in the 1990s attempted something like realism, but managed only to dramatize the legend of the Lizard King. Meanwhile, outside of a few high-rotation tracks on classic rock stations, most of their work took a back seat to Jim's ever-growing status as a cultural icon. The Doors' Every Album, Every Song dusts off the vinyl and puts on the headphones for a sustained reappraisal of the band's musical career. Hidden gems, deep cuts, overrated top 10 hits, and an enigmatic series of album closers are all subjected to late-night interrogations. Tony Thompson is a Canadian writer based in Melbourne, Australia. He's the author of Summer of Monsters, a novel about Mary Shelley's early life, and Shakespeare, the most famous man in London. His articles on books, music, and education have appeared in The Age, The Australian, The Daily Review Australia, toppermost.co.uk, and Eureka Street. He's been a regular guest at the Melbourne Writers' Festival and other literary events throughout Australia. To hear a playlist of The Doors, including the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Hi, Tony. Nice to meet you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get to, and the title of the book is Every Album, Every Song. So we're going to get to the albums and the songs, but let's backtrack a bit and let's get to that famous meeting of Ray Manzarek and Jim Morrison. One of the most famous stories in rock and roll. You write Ray Manzarek is probably responsible for the more mythic proportions of the tale as it stands, but it remains one of those moments like Keith and Mick on the train or John and Paul at the church fete. Can you take us back to that summer of 65 when Ray meets Jim?
I suppose it's a little bit unfair to Ray. I mean, it was an important meeting, but I suppose like any time, like any of us meet a good friend and we can remember, or a partner or whatever, we remember that day and it kind of grows and all the details become more and more important. Essentially what happened was they knew each other quite well. It wasn't like they'd never met. In fact, Jim had even climbed on stage and sung Louie Louie with Rick and the Ravens, Ray's band with his two brothers, a sort of frat rock band that recorded 3 singles, which I've talked about in the book. But what happened was they had finished their year at university. They were both at UCLA Film School. Ray did a master's degree in film. He already had a degree in accounting or something like that. And Jim had finished a BA in film studies. So this is summer of 1965. Now, Jim had told Ray that he was going to New York to become a poet. And Ray had always liked him. He always thought he was an interesting guy. And, he was sorry to see him go. Meanwhile, Jim didn't go to New York. He rented an apartment with another film school friend on top of a building, which is now called the Morrison Apartments. It's really close to Venice Beach. He lived there and there was a rooftop and he used to sleep out on the roof at night. It doesn't rain all that much in Southern California, as the song goes, so he was able to have this lovely summer. Anyway, he started to write a lot. He was writing a lot of poetry and he was writing a lot of lyrics, apparently, too, with the idea of forming a band at some stage. This was 65. Like a Rolling Stone would have been on the radio. So I suppose there was a lot of new possibilities around songwriting that appealed to him. And he had the same sort of beat writer background that Bob Dylan had, and he would have recognized something in that. So anyway, he was walking down the beach one day, Venice Beach. And if you know this beach, it must have been the boardwalk because the beach is vast. They never would have seen each other. The beach is so far to the water. I was amazed. But anyway, they were walking down he was walking down the beach and there's Ray Manzarek coming the other way and he sees him and he says, "Oh, I thought you went to New York." "No, I'm here. And so what have you been doing?" "Well, I've been writing some songs." "Really?" says Ray, who's a musician, and he's got this band. And he says, "Well, why don't you sing one for me?" So Jim apparently sang Moonlight Drive, which appears on their second album. And Ray was really taken with it. Now, who knows what it sounded like? Because clearly the tune, unless he'd already conceived of that melody, he may have just kind of read them like a poem brought a bit of musicality into it. But whatever he did, Ray heard something and said, you know what, we got to form a band. We're going to do this. Because I think the Rick and the Ravens had been a frat rock band, meaning they were playing everything from frat parties to bar mitzvahs to military bases. There was a kind of a circuit that these kind of bands played. But of course, by 65, things were changing. Lyrics were becoming more important. Really, the Dylan effect, I suppose. And so Ray would have been very alert to all of that. Well, he was a real intellectual with that, and they're not all that common in rock and roll. There's lots of smart people, lots of interesting people, but yeah, Ray was a real reader and a real thinker, and he would have been interested in expanding the possibilities of rock and roll. So that was the meeting, and the next thing was a jam with his band, and then some demos, which are fascinating, which I outlined in the book, where they recorded some of these songs. Now, they sound very, very much in the sort of garage rock kind of frame, but you can hear it. And that wasn't even the complete band. Robbie Krieger hadn't even shown up yet.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that. Before I ask you, we should mention that Ray was about a handful of years older than Jim. He was born in 1939. I think Jim was born in 44 or 43, maybe. But he was the oldest member of the Doors.
Yeah, oh, yes. Right. Yeah. He like I said, he'd already had a bit of life. He'd done a degree. I think it was in accounting. But anyway, so yeah, he'd finished. This was a very well-educated band. You don't usually get a higher degree and somebody else with a degree in a rock and roll band. But he, I shouldn't say that. Somebody will have 5 zillion examples to say, no, you're wrong.
Send forward all emails to Tony Thompson. I'll give you the. But you're right. I mean, it stands out. He was a very intelligent guy. He was well spoken. There's that footage of when they come off of an airplane. I think they're an airplane, and they're all introducing themselves, and just the way he talked. He talked like a professor, and he wasn't your typical mid-60s rock star.
Oh. In interviews, he was so articulate and so interesting about things. I met him once. I don't think I ended up mentioning this in the book. It was very brief. In 1989, I was meeting somebody at a college radio station at the University of Toronto where I was attending. I wasn't on college radio. I'd done college radio in Peterborough, Ontario for 3 years. So I was meeting somebody at this station. I can't remember why I was meeting them. I can't remember who I was meeting, but I walked in and I ran into somebody I vaguely knew who told me that they were waiting. They could talk for a second, but they were waiting for some guests to come. I said, well, who are the guests? Who's coming? She said, oh, some poet and a guy from that band, The Doors. You can imagine my reaction. A bit younger, maybe somebody who wasn't interested in all of that. And I said, well, who? And then it occurred to me that I had read something, and I said, you mean it's Michael McClure, who, is a character in some Jack Kerouac novels. So this was a big meeting for me. He was at that Six Galleries event where Allen Ginsberg first read Howl in the 50s. So this is an important guy too. But he's with Ray Manzarek from The Doors. So within a couple of minutes, these two walk through the door. These are the two most famous people I've ever met in my life. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I'd said to her, I can't believe this. And she said, oh, well, maybe you can think of some music to play. So the pressure was on. So we just had a very quick chat because she said, oh, we'll pick out some records and we'll play some music. And he said, he named something, which I can't remember. And I said, you should play X's version of Soul Kitchen because you produced that and it's great. And he was like, wow, man, thanks. So we talked about X a little bit, the punk band that he'd produced. But, it's one of those moments. And then, and then they went off to do the interview. And I'd met Ray Manzarek. He was very tall. That's the other thing. I'm about 6 feet and he was taller than me. So unlike most famous people you meet who are tiny, he was a tall guy.
Okay, so that demo tape, let's get into that some more. September of 1965. There's a demo tape made. These are of Jim's songs. One familiar name is part of this recording. That is John Densmore on drums. he, of course, becomes the member of the Doors. But who else was part of this recording? And can you talk about the songs that are on this recording? Because these are, as you write, important recordings in the Doors story.
These songs are really interesting because they're basically Rick and the Ravens had some studio time left over. And they were with a tiny little label, of which there was many, many in California at the time, called Aura Records. Yeah, like I said, they had this studio time left over, and they decided to go into the studio and record some of Jim's songs. It was his brothers, his two brothers, and a bass player called Patty Sullivan. And this was at World Pacific Studios, which is a famous studio that you come across a lot in 60s recordings. I think Neil Diamond owns it now. It's called Archangel. It's in a place called Beverly Grove, so sort of just a neighborhood south of Beverly Hills, I think. The recordings are interesting because you've got Moonlight Drive, which of course was this first song that Jim sang, Hello, I Love You, which became a huge hit. What's really significant was that when they came to record Waiting for the Sun, and that's a kind of an interesting and slightly sad story, because Paul Rothchild, who generally had really good judgment about things, was a terrific producer, just got the yips about the Celebration of the Lizard cycle, which they wanted to put on the first side. It would have been a really good record. I've talked about this in the book. It drives me crazy because it's a little bit like a tipping point where the Doors lost direction. But when he rejected Celebration of the Lizard, and I can talk more about why that happened later, but they were scrambling for songs. And I think the owner of Elektra Records, his son, said, hey, what about that Hello, I Love You song? He'd continued to listen to these demos, probably on one of those old reel-to-reel recordings. And so they listened to it again, and Paul Rothchild had never heard it because it was something from long before they were on Elektra. And he said, yeah, that'll do. So it's important in that way because it was the source for Hello, I Love You, which is it's a pretty light song as far as Jim Morrison's lyrics go, but that's where it came from. The other thing on there is Summer's Almost Gone, which turned up later, My Eyes Have Seen You, and End of the Night. This kind of last song on the album situation with the Doors, where they end the first album with the end, they end the second album with When the Music's Over. But so these are these heavy songs at the end of records, but also within albums. On the first album, End of the Night, I only say this because I think it would have made a fantastic last song on a future record. But from my perspective, one of the Doors' great songs. So that's also on the demo. The other thing is Go Insane, which turns up much later it appears in a section of Celebration of the Lizard, Go Insane.
Now, Celebration of the Lizard is...
Celebration of the Lizard was a long form, like it's like a suite of songs, including Not to Touch the Earth, which is on Waiting for the Sun, that was going to appear as the first side of the album that became Waiting for the Sun. All the lyrics appear, I think, on the back of the record, but the decision was taken not to do this. So Waiting for the Sun would have been one side of the Celebration of the Lizard. It's on the live album, too. I think that's the first place most people heard it. It's a whole series of little fragments, but it's really good. And the recorded version's terrific. And it's really interesting. Now, this is very much the Jim Morrison Doors. Like this is the poetry and the storytelling and shifts in mood and all of that kind of thing, and all the sort of mythic stuff that he was interested in. But the problem was, by 68 was that the Doors were, this is always the problem, the Doors were making a lot of money for Elektra. Like they were financing everything else Elektra was doing. And you get artists on Elektra like Tim Buckley, brilliant, but he wasn't selling a lot of records. But Jan Holtzman and Paul Rothchild and these people around Elektra, this was a terrific label. They really loved this stuff, and they wanted to keep going with it. They wanted to keep developing artists like Buckley, but unfortunately, they didn't sell enough records. The Doors sold records, a lot of records. These Light My Fire was number one in the Summer of Love in 67. And then, they turn around and they come up with Well, I mean, all the singles from that record did well, and the albums themselves sold well. So this is hard, but I think probably they were reluctant to see a kind of a significant drop in that cash flow. And so if they had gone with something more experimental with that third album, with the Celebration of the Lizard and maybe 4 or 5 other songs on the other side, I suppose there was a possibility that they would lose their pop audience. They would lose those kind of sales. I hope I'm wrong, but unfortunately, it's still a business. I think that must have been part of it. Rothschild always said he just didn't think it was any good, but then it appeared in full on the live album, which he oversaw. So I'm a bit unconvinced by that. But
we should mention, by the way, Jack Holtzman. You mentioned his name. He was the guy he was the founder and head of Elektra Records, and then Rothschild was the guy. He worked for Elektra. He produced all but the last Doors album. He opted out of that, which we'll get to. But he was essentially the Doors producer throughout.
Yeah, Jack Holtzman was a really interesting character, and he'd worked with Paul Rothschild in the early 60s. Rothschild had actually done time for possession, like people did in those days, the one joint, and he got busted and thrown in jail. And when he got out, Holtzman it was a big deal to have done time for possession in the 60s, in the early 60s. He got him producing again and really made him part of the Elektra family. So Rothschild felt like he owed something to Holtzman. Rothschild did not want to produce the Doors at first. He wasn't interested. He'd produce Paul Butterfield Blues Band, which was much more his kind of thing, a really, this sort of hardcore Chicago blues band. And he wasn't really that interested in doing something like the Doors, but luckily he did. And he just did a fantastic job. He's one of those producers from the 60s. To me, he's almost an equivalent of sort of an American George Martin, really. His ability to hear what this band was actually about and to translate that into a production that wasn't overblown, but just got it. He was able to emphasize what needed to be emphasized. He realized that he had a really good drummer in Densmore, a really inventive drummer. He was able to think through. I mean, they did bring bass players in, but he was able to kind of just to hear what a band that didn't have a bass player would sound like with a bass player and all of that kind of thing. So he's really interesting. He's one of those producers I often think I would have loved him to have produced a couple of other bands from the 60s. I always think of the Loving Spoonful. I don't think they were, as much as they had these hit singles with Kama Sutra, I always feel like they nearly signed with Elektra. And I reckon they would have been a really interesting band because he would have heard some of the elements in that band. Whereas I think they were a much better band than their catalog would suggest.
And sadly, he didn't live long either, Rothschild. He was mid-90s. He died in 1995. He's only 59 years old.
Yeah, it was just after I moved here. I remember reading it in Mojo magazine or something. And thinking, gosh, he wasn't that old.
You talk about the investment that Elektra made in the Doors, which is important because there was a label prior to that. Columbia Records signed the Doors, right? And they essentially ignored the Doors. What happened there? They signed them, but they didn't do anything with them.
Yeah, they were signed by a young executive, a young hip executive who was hanging around the Whiskey A Go-Go. And, he recognized that Morrison was the real deal as far as a front man, as far as a performer. There was an enormous amount of charisma. Even when Morrison, I think in the early days, was quite shy on stage and found it very hard. And a lot of the more extreme sort of behavior, I think, came out of a bit of nervousness initially. And he recognized they were good and signed them. The problem was that he couldn't get anyone else at Columbia Records interested. He just couldn't convince anybody. So the contract just ran out of steam. So there was this period where they were playing the Whiskey and they were a Columbia recording artist, but they hadn't recorded anything. And it was just one of those, I mean, it could have been one of those things where they never got signed and that would have been it. I don't think so, but it is interesting. They were signed by a major label who just didn't do anything with them. They must have been kicking themselves when Light My Fire hit.
Oh my God.
like that guy at Decca Records who knocked back the Beatles. They must have thought, what were we thinking?
Well, and they weren't alone. A lot of labels were turning them down. Even one label heard Go Insane and said, get the hell out of here. What is this stuff? But did Columbia give them an out Did they say, we'll let you out of this and you can sign with somebody else? Is that what happened?
Yeah, fortunately, it wasn't some horror show. It was of a contract. Basically, the out was that if there was nothing released, nothing had been recorded by a certain point, the contract was void. That protects, I suppose, even in those days, protected artists from being signed and then kind of just put on ice forever. So yeah, the contract just ran out of steam, and that was the end of it. By which point, Holtzman had somehow been drawn to the whiskey to see them. And he wasn't entirely sure, apparently sitting there wasn't entirely sure about the band, but what swayed him, I mean, he was a little bit older, of course. What swayed him was their version of Alabama song, the Kurt Weill, Bertolt Brecht song from Mahogany. Whiskey Bar, which I think was Ray Manzarek, who was an erudite fellow who had the Lotta Lenya album that everybody had in the 50s. Bob Dylan talks about it in Chronicles. And who thought, well, if we're playing a bar called the Whiskey, we might as well sing a song about a whiskey bar. But Holtzman apparently, I suppose the rest of it sounded like garage rock to him. But when he heard that, he heard that sort of, I don't know, that extra something that the Doors have. And that was what convinced him. So my son's a musician, and I always think, play all your songs, because you never know which one is gonna grab somebody in the audience.
Right. There's something important that happens during that period when they were with Columbia that I thought was interesting. They're considering finding a bass player, but instead they opt to go a different route. And this is while they were with Columbia. Can you talk about why they decided against it and the instrument that influenced their decision to not go with a bass player?
It's such a funny story, because there wasn't really, I mean, I suppose I was going to say, I don't know, like even in jazz, the rhythm section is pretty standard. Like you can have any range of instruments in jazz, but you tend to have a drummer and a bass player, because that's the foundation of whatever you're going to do. The thing that they said, they played with Paddy Sullivan a couple of more times, and I think they tried a few different bass players. And the only comment, one of them said that we sounded like the Stones with a bass player, which is a really funny comment, because who wouldn't want to sound like the Rolling Stones in 1965 or 1966? Sure. But the problem, of course, was sounding too much like the Stones, sounding too much like one more blues garage band doing, taking American blues through the filter of British blues and reproducing it in the States. And they were not the Paul Butterfield blues band. They did not have, they were really good musicians, I think all of who grew into the job, but they weren't blues musicians as such. And somewhere they decided that it would be easier without a bass player. And Ray picked up this bass organ, this Fender Rhodes bass organ. They got the organ itself. He got an organ free from Columbia and somehow managed to get this Fender bass unit to put on top of it. And so whether this was a provisional thing while they looked for a bass player, or was a conscious decision to try a sound where he would play the bass parts, I'm not sure. In retrospect, it was a great idea and it made the Doors sound, but at the time it may have been just, okay, let's do this until we find someone who can play with us. Because they invited Doug Lubin from Clearlight, who were another electro band, one great album, but that's it. They invited him to join the Doors, and he said no, because he thought Clearlight were going to be huge. One of those sort of decisions. So it wasn't as though they were against the idea of a bass player, but for some reason it became, at the time it seemed may have to do with the dynamics of the band. They decided to stick with the four members, and they used the Fender bass organ. So yeah, that all happened during the Columbia period. So by the time they got to the Whiskey, they'd been playing a small bar in Hollywood. They did a long session at a small bar in Hollywood before moving to the Whiskey. And when they moved to the Whiskey, that was the lineup of the band. So
yeah, that lineup is Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums. And we get to that first Doors album, a classic, January 1967. It's released, 11 tracks in all, Break On Through to the Other Side, Soul Kitchen, The Crystal Ship, 20th Century Fox, Alabama Song Whiskey Bar, Light My Fire, Backdoor Man, I Looked at You, End of the Night, Take It As It Comes, and The End. Wow. That's perfection right there. That is absolute perfection. And it's recorded in the summer of 1966 at Sunset Sound Recorders in Hollywood. And you write that it made your heart race as a teen hearing it for the first time in 1980. And all these years later, it still stands up. It's aged well. And you write that this is a band at their hungriest. Talk about this album, why it's held up so well over time.
That's a very good question. It is a fantastic album. I mean, if you put Doors' greatest hits on it and sold it, I think people who didn't know the Doors would buy it and assume that these were the best songs they'd ever done. I don't think you'd have a hard time selling it that way. I mean, there's lots of other great Doors songs, but there are an awful lot of them on this record. I think the production has helped. I mean, just on a really technical level, it's a sharp production. Listening to it more recently a lot, just how bright everything is. And the songs they're distinctive, like the melodies are distinctive. There's none of the, I suppose, I don't want to start like a kind of a riot with garage, punk fans, but there is a tendency with, bands like the Seeds who are really good and were an influence on the Doors, these kind of Hollywood garage bands and LA garage bands that around. But, the Seeds albums, there tends to be a couple of standout tracks. I'm already feeling the emails, a couple of standout tracks, and then a lot of stuff which unfortunately sounds pretty similar. It's in the same key. It's kind of variations on the kind of 3-chord, them's Gloria kind of thing. And this album is so diverse. I mean, everything from Break On Through, which is of course, it is kind of like a really, like a fast garage punk song, but it's got a kind of Latin beat or something, which changes things up. So this is partly the production, but it's also partly the band. I think these guys it's a unique group because Densmore had been in marching bands, which I'm sure it isn't completely unusual among drummers in the 60s, but he'd done this at quite high levels, marching band. So the idea of a beat in that kind of context, I think he saw things differently. He saw the role of the drummer a little bit differently than a lot of other drummers. And also without a bass, he said this quite often, without a bass, he had to do a little bit more than simply hit, because he had to kind of create a sort of counter melody and that kind of thing with his drums. I'm not a very good musician, and I'm only a little bit on top of music theory, but I think that's what he's said in interviews. Then you get Robbie Krieger, whose background is largely flamenco guitar, folk blues, and he was really interested in guitar players like Spider John Corner, who was an early associate of Bob Dylan, who was in a trio, a blues trio. The albums were quite popular at the time. They're kind of forgotten now, but he really loved that sort of stuff. And then Manzarek, who was somebody who'd taken piano lessons when he was a kid, so he had a lot of classical music in his head, but was a jazz fan, but was also a guy from Chicago. This was only sort of a California band because Jim was from Florida and Manzarek was from Chicago. So he was also a pretty hardcore blues fan, and he had a lot of knowledge of Chicago blues. So musically, they're a little bit more of a mix than a lot of the other bands at the time, where you would get people who would come together, kind of like-minded people who had been folkies, like the Byrds, where you get somebody like Roger McGuinn, who'd been a folkie, Chris Hillman, who'd played in bluegrass bands, Gene Clark, who'd been in a pop folk band, and you get and David Crosby, and you get these people coming sort of like-minded, whereas the Doors, big influences. The Byrds are great, incidentally, but this is the difference. So yeah, I think the variety of songs and also the lyrics, of course, are really interesting. I mean, it's things like The Crystal Ship. It's such an interesting song. It's a long way from, you've left and I'm blue and I wish you'd come back, and and I'm angry at you. It's a song about being drawn into this, tempted into this, offered this crystal ship, this wonderful place, and do you go, and what happens when you do, and then things like End of the Night, which was, the title came from a novel by Céline, this French writer of the mid 20th century, this really very, very grim sort of French existentialist novel. And then The End, which honestly, it's funny because we come used to this song, Apocalypse Now, references to it. I try to imagine what this would have sounded like in early 1967. We were having just a quick discussion on Twitter one day where somebody put forth the idea that the first Velvet Underground album was also the first alternative rock album, which I suppose can have a lot of meanings, but that something like Heroin was the first sort of alternative rock song. It's an interesting argument, but I came in and said that The End had actually come out 9 months earlier, and I thought that if you were going to make an argument for an alternative rock song, it was hard to think of anything that comes before The End that sounds anything like it. I mean, it is so strange and so kind of unexpected. And, the mix of poetry and music and all the changes in mood and this narrative, and there is a narrative there, but it goes all kinds of places. So
I think there are so many aspects to why this is still so great. This is my personal favorite Doors album. If I have to pick one, it's this one. And I think there are many reasons why the album has been so successful and continues to be all these years later. I think one of the reasons is the fact that they played The End in Apocalypse Now. I mean, that movie sends the Doors into a whole new stratosphere. Then we have the emergence of classic rock radio, who embraced a band like the Doors, exposed them to a whole new audience that way. There's the mystery in Jim's lyrics. What are they about? To this day, there are lyrics that we may never find out what exactly he's saying in it. And the music itself is just brilliant. And I find it fascinating because every new generation of teenagers and 20-somethings, they discover this band, but particularly this album and these songs, and it just strikes some kind of a note with them. There's something in the youth culture that they and also, if you're not from the 60s and you wish you were, this is the kind of album you listen to and think, boy, this is what it must have been like.
That is for sure. And that's exactly where I was in about 1980, was wishing it was the 1960s.
Right.
And the Doors they just sounded so, they were so mysterious is exactly the right word.
And we can't forget the Oliver Stone movie is another that furthers it even more. And the legend of Jim Morrison, how much of that movie is fact, I don't think it even matters in the sense that it grew that fascination that people had with Jim.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings about that film, but I think there's no question that it grew the myth of Jim. It's amazing how even in the 1980s, I can remember wandering into shops, record shops, head shops as they used to be called, where they would have rock posters all over the place. And I remember that there was that poster of Jim with the dogs, and he's got sunglasses on, and I mean. It was at 14. I was like, that's what I want to be. That's how I want to look.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
It was just, that image was so powerful. And of course, there was the famous Rolling Stone issue. I think it's 1979. They had a picture of him on the front cover. It would have been around the time Apocalypse Now came out. It's a photograph of Jim, and the memorable headline said, "Jim Morrison, he's hot, he's sexy, and he's dead."
Oh, my God. Is that what it said on the cover?
Yeah. And it was, that sort of signaled a bit of a revival of interest in the Doors. And then, I hope I've got the chronology right here, but of course, the Apocalypse Now, the use of The End in Apocalypse Now brought a lot of people back to the band. Then they released, I think probably on the heels of Apocalypse Now, they released that Red Greatest Hits record that a lot of people had in the 1980s. Some reviewer, I can't remember what magazine, took exception to my assertion that everybody, if you were in your 50s, you remember a time when everybody you knew owned that record. But I stand by that. There was a point where everybody I knew owned that Greatest Hits record.
I'm going to tell you, my older brother had it, and it was in just about every college dorm room I walked into, walking down the hallway. Oh, you have that too?
Yeah. I think that's, I think we talk about the 1980s and people think of, post-punk and all of that kind of thing. And that was all going on. But from where I was standing, the Doors were very popular with a lot of different kinds of kids and a lot of different people. So
let's start with Break On Through, the opening track. What is this song about? You say it could be all of the things fans and critics speculate, but it could be even more than we'll ever know.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's the first song on their first album, because it does operate a little bit like a mission statement for the band. I'm sure this wasn't what was intended, or maybe it was, but it really, Jim was a reader or a student, I suppose, of Nietzsche and the sort of philosophy of kind of getting past societal expectations and rules and conventional morality and finding truth beyond all that. And he had a pretty well developed idea of all of this by the time he started writing these songs. So Break On Through has variously been, just like all of their music, it's an acid song, and it probably is to some extent. He was taking a lot of acid in the summer of '65, but I think, to me, what it sounds like is more like I said, like a call to arms in a sense. This is what we need to do. We need to break through, and we need to break into this other life that isn't controlled. It isn't the sort of American life that's being portrayed on television or that's being sold to us as reality. And there must be more. I think it's a great way to open the record. It's such a terrific song too. I mean, it's got that just unforgettable. It's one of those things like the beginning of Like a Rolling Stone. It's just unforgettable the way it begins, and it just hits you, kind of here when it comes through. The other thing was, apparently he was spending a lot of time walking around Venice, the neighborhood in California, which of course has canals and bridges. So there's some. I was really interested in the idea that Venice Beach and specifically in Los Angeles generally come into these songs a lot more than is often noted, and so I like that idea that he's sort of thinking about the bridge metaphorically as well as he looks around Venice, which is all the bridges and canals. It was somebody's idea in the 1920s of creating a Venice in California. And I think Charlie Chaplin lived there in the early days. And then it kind of became a pretty seedy neighborhood. It is no longer a seedy neighborhood. It's a very, very expensive and very nice neighborhood now.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Light My Fire is another Doors classic. This is one I never grew tired of, no matter how many times I've heard this. It started out as a folk rock song, but it became something else, a concoction of influences, including John Coltrane, Miles Davis, some Bach in there too. You talked earlier about all these influences the Doors had. This is a song that has quite a few influences. Yeah,
it's the thing on that first album is that they were listening to Brazilian bossa nova, jazz and pop. Sergio Mendes, that was really happening at that point. That Sergio Mendes, what's the album called? Is it Brazil 1966, Brazil 66? I'm not an expert on this music. And there was the Getz Gilberto record. Those were with Anton Jobim. That kind of music was really big in the mid-'60s, a bit forgotten now, and forgotten how much of an influence it was on people. And Manzarek and Krieger, I think, were very, very hooked into it. So there is, on things like Light My Fire, a discernible Latin aspect to these songs, and Break On Through, of course. But yeah, Light My Fire, and Manzarek claimed that he got that classic organ riff from Bach. That's what he often said, although he did change that. Sometimes he mentioned other people, but generally Bach came up in that.
That's what's fascinating, all the influences they're taking these songs from, but in the end, it sounds like the Doors.
Yeah, they certainly borrowed things. There's certainly stuff that, like Touch Me on the Soft Parade. If you listen to Come On Marianne by Frankie Valli, and Krieger eventually came clean and admitted that that's where he got it, but it is the same riff. Like, it's not just. I'd recommend anybody listening to go away at some when you finish listening, go and listen on Spotify to Come On Marianne, and if you know Touch Me Well, you'll say, oh, but it doesn't matter because this is rock and roll. This is the folk tradition where bits and pieces are taken to create something new. This is postmodern music. And while they did do that, yeah, what they came up with was something that just sounded like the Doors. And they're so recognizable as a band. And, I think the Beatles, the great bands of the 60s, the Beatles, the Stones, the Byrds, the Doors, Creedence Clearwater Revival are a great favorite of mine as well. These are bands that did pick and choose their influences, but ultimately created something that was unique. And I think that's very, very much the Doors.
The End is one of the most iconic Doors tracks. What is The End about? Is it simply a breakup song, or is it much more complex?
It starts off as a breakup song. He had a relationship with a high school girlfriend, a young woman who had come to California with him. And over the summer of '65, this is getting into a personal dimension, and we're just speculating, but eventually she wasn't going to go on the kind of acid journey that Jim was going on, and things started to kind of fray between them. They were young, this was still, they were very young people, and this happens obviously. But The End, a lot of these songs have elements of being breakup songs. And in fact, a lot of this album sounds like it's breakup songs. This could be one of the great breakup albums. It's never noted as such. But so The End does start off with this breakup. What happened with this song was that and unfortunately there aren't any recordings, at least that I've ever heard, of this from before it was recorded. So it started off as a sort of fragmentary thing they would do, which would lead into some improvisation by the band, by Jim. And what began to evolve, and this is one of those myths where trying to get to the actual story is difficult, but apparently there was this one night at the Whiskey A Go-Go, this famous evening at the Whiskey A Go-Go where Jim didn't turn up. They found him at the Tropicana Motel down the street, dragged him in, got him up on stage, and eventually, and he was on acid, and he was completely off his bean, but he was remarkable at being able to perform and record vocals no matter how wasted he was. And his timing was always good. And that's one of those mysteries about the band. But they got him up there and they started to do this thing, The End. And he launched into this thing about the ancient face, where he should take the ancient face from the gallery. Well, that's Greek theater, where they always wore masks. And then he walked to The Killer Awoke Before Dawn, and he goes into this sort of meditation, this sort of Freudian kind of meditation, Oedipal thing, where he's walking down the hall and he sees his father, or he sees his brother and his sister, and he sees his father, and he says, "Father, I want to kill you." Then he gets to his mother's room, and apparently Ray Manzarek thought, suddenly it occurred to him what was about to happen. He thought, this is the Oedipal story. This is Oedipus Rex. He's going to kill his father. Well, we know what's going to happen with his mother. And of course, then Jim delivered this line and all hell broke loose. But apparently the Whiskey, which was a wild scene in 1966, apparently went very quiet as people started to recognize what was about to happen. And then he delivered these lines, and supposedly they got fired immediately, but there's some question about whether they actually did get fired, whether you'd fire a band that was attracting that much attention. But they went into the studio immediately afterwards and recorded this album. So the rest of the summer of '66 was spent working on the record. So that was the version of The End that was recorded. But yeah, it's a sort of breakup song that he goes on this sort of subterranean psychological Oedipal journey, and then comes back at the end to a sort of wistful breakup song.
And is there a better band to perform behind those lyrics? I think of Densmore tapping away on the cymbals. Just the whole atmospheric sound they create.
just incredible, because Jim really was a pure natural as a singer, because he hadn't had any training. He didn't have any experience. I mean, this was not somebody who had been singing since he was in high school. It wasn't one of those situations. I mentioned Creedence Clearwater Revival. That band had been together since the 50s. So they'd had a lot. They'd been doing a lot of singing. Fogerty had been singing a lot for a long time, whereas not that there's any real comparison, but Morrison was not a singer, but he had this ability as an actor, an ability to convey stories and ideas. And yeah, what a great band to have behind you. Because the other thing, I suppose, is the sort of cinematic aspect of the Doors, which I was interested in. You've got two film students in one band, so that when you come to something like the end, it really is soundtrack music in a sense. That's the soundtrack to the story that he's telling. And as you say, Densmore adding all this color with percussion, and Robbie adding these sort of Spanish guitar fills, and it just makes for such an incredible performance.
Yeah, the push and the pull, the atmospheric shifts throughout. And also, people get too caught up in whether somebody can sing and not as focused on whether they're a great singer, which is the argument a lot of the Dylan fans would make. Yeah, he can't sing, but he's a great singer. In other words, puts emotion to every single lyric, knows when to put the pedal to the floor, knows when to slow up, shift, go left, go right, do this, that. By the time you get to the end of the song, you cross that finish line, and that singer, if it's a great singer, they take you on a ride. And Jim Morrison did that. And there are some singers out there that are like that. Who cares about your range? It's how you sing it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. He could tell the story. I mean, that's what they always used to say about Sinatra. Sinatra, technically as a singer, I don't want to start the emails. I'm not an expert on that kind of music, but to me, what Sinatra does best with the standards that he sang was he gets the story across better than anybody else. You know what Autumn Leaves or whatever it is he's singing, you really get what this story, what the emotion, what's happening in this scenario that he's creating. I play saxophone, and if I'm trying to play a standard that I don't know very well, I always go to Sinatra's version if he did it, because I feel like then I can understand the song before I go on to the more sort of esoteric versions of it. And to me, Sinatra was a favorite of Morrison. He really loved Presley, loved early rock and roll. That was his thing. He'd grown up, as that age group, he'd grown up listening to, the Texas radio that's mentioned in that song, The Wasp, the same sort of border radio stations that Manzarek was listening to in Chicago, and Robbie Robertson was listening to in Toronto. These signals went all over the States, and so they all heard this. It was kind of like an internet of great music in the 50s. So he loved early rock and roll, but he was interested in Sinatra, and I'd never made the connection myself, but I was sitting with my dad in the 80s at some point, and we were watching TV late at night, and the clip came on of Light My Fire. Dad said, "He sounds like Frank." And I was about to disagree, as teenage boys do with their dads, but I thought, he's right. So it's that ability to convey a story that I think Morrison did so well. But on top of that, he also had very, very good timing for somebody who wasn't trained as a singer. There's a clip of him singing, I think it's Wild Child, that they're in the studio recording. And he's obviously not entirely sober, and they get him set up with the microphones and everything. But boy, does he come in on the right moment. I mean, I would defy anybody sober to come in. He just times it perfectly. So he did have a sense of timing, and even a lot of the live recordings, which I listened to a lot of for the book, and you can tell that he's had a lot to drink in some of them. He's not at his best. But he rarely misses cues. He rarely sings flat, which is, I mean, a lot of rock, the blues idiom does tend to, there is a sort of a flat sort of sound to the vocals, which is fine, but he doesn't sing flatter than that. And his timing rarely fails him, which is amazing, really. I mean, even at that Miami show, the famous Miami show, he's doing okay when he's singing. It's when he starts talking that the trouble starts.
The Doors' Every Album, Every Song by Tony Thompson is out now through Sonic Bond. The band follows up the debut with 1967's Strange Days. You write that rock and roll is littered with one-hit wonders and disappointing second albums. Strange Days isn't one of them. The title track, the lyrics, very much influenced by Jim's love of poetry, right?
Yeah, Strange Days is a wonderful song. It's a really evocative song of the kind of the. I think he's talking about the world as it stood in 1967, and this is where the counterculture really starts to become obvious. And it's such a sort of bittersweet sort of evocation of the world that he'd kind of fallen into. And they weren't famous yet. This is one of the great things about Strange Days is that, and boy, I wish more bands had done this. Before the kind of craziness hit with the hits, with Light My Fire, they got them back into the studio and recorded another album, including some of those songs from the demo. And so what you get with the first two albums are two pre-fame records, which is pretty unusual in rock and roll, because usually the first album comes out, they promote it, they get the hit, they go on tour, and everything goes to hell, and then they have 10 minutes to come up with the second album. That's I think David Crosby said you've got 10 years to write, the lyrics to your first album in 10 minutes, between the sound check and your show in Cleveland to write the second one. And with Strange Days, yeah, it's still that he's still drawing from the same source. So yeah, that's a fantastic song. It's an early song though. When I say it's about the world he fell into, it actually is on the London Fog recordings from '66. So it's a pretty early song for him. But I guess it's that world that he occupied in '65, living in Venice Beach. And that was an interesting world, because Venice was this isn't particularly well known, but the beat scene in Los Angeles, the San Francisco one's much better known, but the beat writing scene in Los Angeles was centered around Venice Beach. By the time Jim got there, of course, it was kind of fraying, and obviously it was the sort of the last days of that kind of thing. But the sort of early hippie kind of 60s world was starting to emerge in that area on the heels of that former beat scene. And Strange Days seems to be about that world that he saw around him.
You mentioned the London Fog show. That's now available. You can now get that. That is from 1966. What's the title again?
I think it's just called London Fog or Band from Venice or something like that. It's got a whole bunch of titles on the actually, I had the CD sitting on my desk, but it's
This is a seedy bar on the Sunset Strip. This is where the Doors were cutting their teeth. This is not a high-class establishment, right?
No, and it wasn't well attended either. They didn't attract big crowds until they got to the whiskey. Yeah, this is the spring of 1966. They got this regular gig at this place called the London Fog, tiny little place with a sort of British theme, maybe because of the Beatles or whatever, and tiny stage, go-go dancer on one side, which was pretty standard in those kind of places. And they played there. Jim was very nervous. They had played a few little gigs at the end of '65. They filled some of the Rick and the Ravens gigs. I think they played a bar mitzvah, which I think is great. But they played this London Fog, and they played it a lot. And I said in the book, and I was glad some reviewers seemed to approve of this comment, that I thought this was their Hamburg. Malcolm Gladwell, the writer, talks about Hamburg as the Beatles' 10,000 hours of mastery. I mean, whatever you think of that theory, but it's certainly, a residency is great for a young band, because generally the audience is they're either supportive or they're not there to see the band, so it doesn't matter. So you've got all this space to experiment, to try new things. You're playing this set, you say, that wasn't working as well, let's put this in, let's extend this a little bit, let's put this as the last song, let's try it as the first song. There's a lot of space in a kind of real environment, not the rehearsal hall or whatever, but a real environment to try things out. So the London Fog, yeah, like they say, that's where the Beatles became the Beatles, and it's hard to argue with that. I mean, obviously there was a lot of material there, but they those sort of 8-hour sets they were doing in Hamburg, that it's hard to imagine that that's not where a lot of things coalesced. Watching the Let It Be movie, like everybody else the last few days, I kept thinking, when they were able to so quickly snap into an old song, I thought that's Hamburg. And Hamburg gets mentioned a lot too. I don't want to go into a long thing about Let It Be, but Get Back. It's called Get Back. I keep calling it Let It Be, but the Get Back film, how often Hamburg is mentioned. So back to the Doors, I think the London Fog and to a lesser extent the Whiskey A Go-Go operated as that kind of period. So fortunately, this recording turned up. It's not complete. Krieger has tantalizingly said that there is more recordings available, but I don't know where they are, that might have more Doors songs on it, because really Strange Days is virtually the only Doors original, I think, on it. There might be one other, but it's mostly blues covers, which is fine, but it would be very, very interesting to hear some of that material. I would love to hear what Moonlight Drive sounded like at that time, or End of the Night, if they were doing it. Light My Fire, even, and certainly The End would be fascinating.
Well, if anybody wants to visit the London Fog, you're going to get a haircut instead. I'm looking here. It's on 8919 Sunset Boulevard. It was a few doors down from the Whiskey A Go-Go. It is now, according to Wikipedia, in the year 2019, Like a Gentleman Barbershop.
Ironic.
Jim's ghost is in there getting his haircut.
That's right. Finally getting that haircut. So.
That's cool. That's cool. Back to that second album. We talked about the opening track. Let's talk about a little bit more about that track and Paul Rothchild, because you mentioned he's an important part of the Doors sound, something he does with Jim's voice here that makes a huge difference. And you write that this is the first use of a synthesizer in rock and roll.
Yeah, it's amazing. I sort of made a sort of, I don't know, that suggested that this put them on the table as an early prog band, because this is the first use of the synthesizer on a rock and roll record. A synthesizer hadn't been around very long; they're very hard to use. But Elektra Records, who did a lot of kind of experimental, they were interested in this kind of thing. They'd done an album called The Zodiac with another singer. And some of the studio musicians for the Wrecking Crew people, they'd put together the synthesizer record based on the Zodiac star signs. A guy called Paul Beaver, who was an early adherent of the Moog synthesizer, came into the orbit of Bruce Botnick, the engineer who engineered all these records, and Paul Rothchild. And they were looking for something a little different on Strange Days. So, yeah, they ran his voice through a synthesizer, and then they put it together with a track of him singing straight. It creates a great effect, I think. It's this sort of it just makes everything sound a little off balance, which, of course, suits the idea of the song that Strange Days have found us. Yeah, that was it. And apparently the Beatles were quite interested in the Doors. I mean, you hear the Beatles were interested in everybody, but apparently there was some curiosity about the Doors among the Beatles. And when they were doing Magical Mystery Tour, Paul Beaver somehow got himself to England and spent some time with the Beatles. And a Beatles expert would know much more about that. But yeah, the synthesizer, that's where it starts for synthesizer and rock and roll, which is incredible, really. They never used it again, but obviously other people did to a greater and greater extent as the years went by. Paul Beaver apparently ended up on top of some mountain in Alaska waiting for an alien spacecraft, which was due to refuel or something like that.
Are you kidding?
Very 60s story about him ending up, that's, I think Bruce Botnick or Paul Rothchild mentioned that in an interview, and I like that. I put it in the book. I thought that's great. I love the idea of this guy, from synthesizers to refueling alien spacecrafts on top of, Mount McKinley or something like that.
That's hilarious. Love Me Two Times, another hit single for the band. Robbie Krieger's riff adapted from a John Corner song. Can you talk about that and Corner's influence on other artists?
Yeah, you can hear the original of that, and it certainly that's the riff. That's where he found it. But again, it's not lifting anything. It's just it's an old blues riff. John Corner would have found it himself. Would have found it somewhere, wherever, Blind Willie McTell record or something like that. So, but yeah, I think "Love Me Two Times" is just a terrific song, a real classic.
Lyrically about somebody going off to Vietnam.
Yeah, apparently that was the idea, that it was about, again, it's the time they lived in. The Doors are sometimes decontextualized a bit from the 60s, but this was around them, the people they knew and they family members, and so yeah, the sort of sad idea of a soldier going off to Vietnam and well, love me two times. Once for tomorrow, once for today, and it's been, got interpreted in all kinds of, sexual kind of innuendo ways. But I suspect, like a lot of things, that's not how it began. That it did begin as a genuine song about a soldier leaving, which makes it, if you listen to it that way, makes it very, very affecting, I think.
People Are Strange is another highlight from this album. This, Robbie Krieger has said, grew out of a period of depression for Jim Morrison.
Yeah, Morrison, I suppose, somewhere between the recording of the first album and they were starting to play some gigs, he started to. He was never a particularly happy individual, I guess, and I guess he enjoyed being in the band. I think he started to hit some pretty hard times very early in the story, and apparently, came up with People Are Strange, which is, I think, one of their greatest songs, really. I love this song. And it's sort of the sense of alienation is so powerful in it. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is the cinematic quality of it. I talked about this in the book, how it's the descriptions. What Jim does is which makes him a very cinematic writer, he describes how things look, and it's not about, he doesn't go inside and say, this is how I was feeling. He tells the story by describing the world as he's seeing it, and I think makes for a really, really interesting set of lyrics.
How about When the Music's Over? This is another great final track to a Doors album. When the Music's Over is like a companion piece to the end. Here Jim is name-checking some films, including The Scream of the Butterfly and The Big Sleep, and includes some of his most memorable phrases like cancel my subscription to the resurrection. Different from the end, though, in that it has no narrative structure here.
No, this is more, I think I said in the book, this is more the sort of William Burroughs, Brian Geisen kind of cut-up technique. He seems to be just taking phrases and putting them together with this. It's a similar idea. It's sort of like the end, when the music's over. I mean, this is about endings. This is about what's left, after everything kind of idea. And he starts to, there's just again, I suspect this began as an improvised piece and grew into the version that we hear on the record. It was a part of their stage show. I think they performed it pretty much every time they played, except when concerts got stopped and that kind of thing. But it seemed to be a real favorite of the band's, and Jim seemed to enjoy going through the various images that he'd created in it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. It's time to check out some of the new and upcoming Books on Rock releases. A Life in Focus, the photography of Graham Nash by Graham Nash, just released on November 30th through Insight Editions on hardcover. Music legend, photographer, and artist Graham Nash reflects on more than 50 years of an extraordinary life in this extensive collection of personal photographs, paintings, and mixed media artwork. Nash presents the images with his own reflections, telling the story behind the pictures and giving insight into the life of one of the greatest musicians of all time. Just released this week on December 1st through Black Swan, Overpaid, Oversexed, and Over There, How a Few Skinny Brits with Bad Teeth Rocked America by David Hepworth. The Beatles landing in New York in February 1964 was the opening shot in a cultural revolution nobody predicted. Hepworth explores a time when everything that was being done, from the Beatles playing Shea Stadium to the Rolling Stones at Altamont, from The Who performing their rock opera at the Metropolitan Opera House, to David Bowie touching down in the USA for the first time with a couple of gowns in his luggage, was being done for the very first time. Rock and roll would never be quite so exciting again. Upcoming releases include Nothing But a Good Time by Justin Quirk, due out December 17th on paperback through Unbound Books. From 1983 until 1991, glam metal was the sound of American culture. This was the world stalked by hair metal bands like Bon Jovi, Kiss, Wasp, Skid Row, Dokken, Motley Crue, Cinderella, Rat, and many more. Big hair, massive amplifiers, drugs, alcohol, piles of money, and life-threatening pyrotechnics. Armed with hairspray, spandex, and strangely shaped guitars, they mark the last great era of supersized bands. And due out December 17th through Sonic Bond Publishing is Led Zeppelin Every Album, Every Song by Steve Pilkington. This book digs into every Led Zeppelin track recorded during their decade-long existence before John Bonham's death brought down the curtain, by way of facts, anecdotes, analysis, and a small dose of humor here and there. Celebrating the triumphs and the arguable lower points, this is an alternative history of the band told via the most important element, the music itself, which has influenced so many down the years. The history of Led Zeppelin is a wild ride. This book shows you why. Find a link to all the newest and upcoming books on rock releases in this episode's show notes page and on our website, bookedonrock.com. The Doors' third album, Waiting for the Sun, released in July of 1968, Ray Manzarek suggests that Jim shows his first signs of a drinking problem at this point. He's struggling with fame. John Densmore even quits the band at one point because Jim is either a no-show or he shows up too drunk to record, but somehow they get it done. Can you talk about the original idea for this album? You did talk about this earlier. I believe this is the one. One side was a long-form piece. That was the initial idea, a chance for the band to push the boundaries a bit, but Paul Rothschild wasn't going to have it, didn't like the idea.
No, he just didn't think it sounded good. So he said, like I said, I've long suspected that it was a commercial decision. And, Rothschild, he generally had pretty good judgment. Elektra had got behind an awful lot of pretty experimental music. When you think of something like Star Sailor by Tim Buckley, you can't really accuse them of being, overly commercially oriented, but the Doors were making them a lot of money. And I think what happened here was that a few things were happening. One, I think Jim's drinking was, as I said, was getting increasingly out of control. Jim provided, if not the day-to-day leadership of the band, he kind of guided the band in a way artistically, I think, to maybe more extent than is generally thought. I talked about this a little bit in relation to the albums after Jim left, which are famously, kind of notorious. But I think he had a lot to do with this type of songs they were doing on those first two albums. And he's just not there. He's just not in control on that third album. And the instinct to do this celebration of the Lizard, which you can hear both in recorded form now and the live version, which came out on Absolutely Live. It's really good, and it's got lots of really interesting bits to it, least of which is Not to Touch the Earth, which did make the album. But you get an album which it's a little bit pulled together quickly because at the last minute, they decided not to do this. So suddenly they needed songs. And Jim wasn't writing, and his notebooks, he was running a bit dry in the old 1965 notebooks. So you get a lot more songs from Krieger here, which are good. But I think the problem is that the Morrison aspect of the Doors gave them that sort of edgy kind of darkness that made the first two records just so engaging. And I think that's missing here on this album. This album it's got some great moments on it. There's no question. It's not a disaster by any means, but it's clear that this is a band that has lost agency and has skipped a beat. That's my feeling. They used to say that about Dylan's motorcycle crash. Here come the emails. That what it represented was that he'd done these three incredible records, and for all kinds of reasons which are obvious to us now, that he couldn't keep going. So there's the motorcycle crash, and then John Wesley Harding, which is a totally different record. And people have said, he skipped a beat in a sense and then changed completely. Not necessarily for the worse, but I feel like that's what happened here. Was they missed the next step, and it took them a very long time to get back on track. That's my feeling about Waiting for the Sun. I don't think it's a terrible album, but I think it's a flawed record.
What does save it commercially, at least, is Hello, I Love You, which is the opening track, and it's a big hit. But you're right that damaged the band's reputation a bit, too poppy.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. I mean, they should have continued to be a force in sort of counterculture music, edgy, the kind of edgy 1960s music. They think of what the Dead were doing at the time. And a lot of the San Francisco bands were just going further and further out, and some incredible music. But the Doors were kind of, they became a bubblegum band, and or at least that's how they were perceived. And that really hurt them, because the counterculture turned on them. Rolling Stone, that whole world sort of turned on them. But the problem with popularity, of course, is it's fleeting. And one minute everybody loves the Doors, and the next minute everybody's moved on to the next band. And they weren't a pop band. They just, Hello, I Love You was, obviously, it was, it had that thing, and it gave them this massive hit. But I think again, it was part of a whole series of events that kind of took them off the path they were on, which I think is a real shame. Now, whether they would have continued on that path, Jim Morrison was obviously in trouble with alcohol, drugs, a lifestyle which did not seem to leave a lot of time for writing, or as he said, sadly once, reading, which he'd sort of stopped doing. Things may not have gone any differently, but I do think that Hello, I Love You, it's a great song, but it did kind of derail them, I think.
Love Street is, as you write, one of the Doors' most sublime moments. The street in question is not actually called Love Street, but this is based on a real place. Can you talk about that? You include a photo of it in your book, too.
Yeah, that's right. Well, like I say, it's still a terrific record, and there's lots of great stuff on it. But Love Street I think, is just a sublime song, and it was a song that he did write. He wrote sometime in 1966 when he and Pamela Corson were living on, I think it's called Rothdale Drive or something, and it runs up the back of the Laurel Canyon General Store, country store, which is still there. And the house they lived in is still there, although apparently a fire destroyed the balcony. But they would sit up there and watch hippies, the kind of Laurel Canyon crew walking up and down the back on this street. And that's where he came up with Love Street. And of course, it's a funny song, because unlike Our House, which, Graham Nash's song about his idyllic time with Joni Mitchell and Laurel Canyon, and a lot of other songs about Laurel Canyon, it's still Jim Morrison, and it's still a bit dark. These diamond-studded flunkies and things like that. Like, it's still, there seems to be a suggestion that all isn't entirely well on Love Street between the couple and between this woman that he describes. But that is a fantastic song. I think one of their greats.
Let's talk about one last track from this third album. That's
Sure.
5-1. I've heard the theory that 5-1 referred to the prediction that young people would soon outnumber the old by 5-1. You write about the other theories and what you think it means, which I never thought about this. Now, I agree with you. I think I'm going with your theory. Talk about what some of the theories were and what yours is.
Yeah, it's one of those songs where there has been a whole bunch of theories, and the baby boomers soon outnumbering all, which was very much an idea of the time, is possible. But the other one, of course, was that there was some idea that African American soldiers outnumbered white American soldiers by 5-1 in Vietnam, which is it's a really interesting. I don't know whether that's the actual statistic. It's probably close. It's probably higher. Who knows? But I imagine that's the kind of theory that came a long time later, because I think that was a discussion that started. The discussion was around during the Vietnam War, but I think that became more widely known as time went by. The more I thought about the song, I thought the clue is the next line. No one gets out of here alive, which is like they say about death and taxes. These are the certainties. And so it doesn't matter what the odds are, 5-1, 1-5, no one gets out of here alive. Doesn't make any difference who you are. We're all going to the same place. So it's a kind of a slightly gloomy idea. But the other one was the odds in, and this is actually where I thought of it, I think, because I thought it's the odds in Russian roulette, 5-1, 1-5, in a 6 barrels in a pistol. But then I thought, no, I think it's really just a kind of a meditation on death, which wasn't unusual in Jim's music. And apparently John Densmore asked him in the studio, "Hey, what's this 5-1, 1-5 thing?" Bands rarely ask the singers about what their lyrics mean. I'm always fascinated with my son's band. The lead singer writes the music, and I say to him, "What do you think that song's about?" He says, "I don't know. Never really given it any thought." But Densmore did ask Jim, and Jim said, "That's for me to know," and wandered away. So Jim wasn't keen to talk about the music. He rarely discussed his lyrics in any detail at all. I mean, even less than most people, I think. When reviewers asked him about, or when interviewers asked him about songs, he was pretty quick to kind of go in another direction.
That fourth studio album often finishes at the bottom of album rankings. In fact, some felt that this marked the end of the Doors. Talking about 1969's The Soft Parade, Jim is in his downward spiral by this time. This was recorded during a period where a lot of stuff going on in his life. Legal issues, I believe, along with the drinking. It's a big reason for what ends up on the record, because Jim checks out most of the time here, which leaves the bulk of the creative ideas to the rest of the band, and as a result, Paul Rothchild feels he needs to essentially dress up the songs a bit here with some strings and horns.
Yeah. Again, I think I said in the book, and I've sometimes said to people that if you want to really hear the Soft Parade, you should probably go and listen to the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album that came out while they were recording it, because I think that was a very, very appealing record to a lot of musicians. People still remember them, but I think they're a bit forgotten of how big they were and how influential they were in the 60s. And Manzarek talks about that album a bit in his biography. I think Densmore might mention it as well. It seemed to be on people's mind that you could open up rock and roll with horns and with a bigger sound, strings, like we could, and of course David Clayton Thomas, also from Toronto, another graduate of my high school. I think he might have been thrown out long before I went there, but he had that same kind of big voice. So you can imagine that's in the mix. Rothchild, again, he gets the blame for this album, but there is some idea that Manzarek and Krieger and Densmore were keen to open up the sound a lot as well. So it's not entirely his fault, and it's not a terrible album. I mean, it's got an awful lot of good music on it. It's got, for me, some of the worst moments from all of the recorded bits and pieces of the suite at the end. The Soft Parade drive me crazy, but for song, it's not a bad record, and it's a lot better than a lot of other stuff that came out at the time. But Morrison is definitely absent. You can really feel his absence on this one, and it was a terrible period for the band. The Miami concert, which was March 1st, I think, in Florida, the Dinner Key Theater, what happened is still there's a lot of speculation about what actually happened, but the recordings of it, I mean, he just sounds mad. I mean, he's yelling at the audience. He's calling them names. You're a bunch of sheep, he's saying terrible things to the audience. So whatever he did, he was completely out of control. And
well, you're right. He's punk before there was punk.
Yeah. When I've been asked a couple of times about the influence of the Doors, I think he had a profound influence on Iggy Pop. And I think, Iggy Pop certainly created that kind of punk sort of ethos on stage, but I think he drew it from Jim Morrison. And also, Jim Morrison's behavior was so provocative, and nobody else was doing that at the time. Certainly there were some wild rockabilly artists like Jerry Lee Lewis who took things pretty far on stage, but what Morrison was doing was being drawn from contemporary theater, and really provocative, the kind of theater that really pushed people's buttons and really tried to engage the audience. I mean, they were breaking down the fourth wall. They were breaking down all the walls. And Morrison was inspired by that. And his performance style, I think is very, very influential. But this wasn't a great time. And then all their bookings got canceled. And of course, any pop kind of obviously suddenly Tiger Beat magazine wasn't knocking anymore when somebody had been charged with indecent exposure in Florida. So it wasn't a great time for them, and he does seem a bit absent on this record. That said, some of the great vocal performances of his career, Tell All the People, Touch Me, Do It, Wild Child, really, really great stuff. Even the Soft Parade, which I think is a bit of a train wreck, really, as a kind of suite of songs. It's got some okay moments on it, but he still sounds great. That's the thing. The voice never really went.
They did manage to have a hit single, though. Touch Me was top 10 single, the last top 10 in the U.S. This was originally to be titled Hit Me, and some have claimed Jim wasn't comfortable with that lyric. That's why they changed it.
Yeah, that's what he said anyway. I think he said he wasn't prepared to yell "hit me" at an audience, but I think considering what he'd already done, like throwing policemen's hats into the crowd and calling out the cops, it's that famous scene where he was arrested on stage. I can't imagine he would have been too worried about singing "hit me" to the audience. But I think he recognized as a writer that "Touch Me" would work better in the lyrics. That there was some ambiguity with "Touch Me" that suited the song better. So I think it was probably more of an artistic decision. He wasn't crazy about the song. In fact, that's when the writing credits went to individual members, because Morrison actually didn't like the song all that much. So he said, well, I don't want my name on that.
I wonder if it would have been released as a single. If it was going to be called Hit Me, would radio stations want that on the radio?
Yeah, again, it may have been a commercial decision to say a song called, Come On, Come On, Come On, Hit Me might have, I don't know. I mean, hit me was an old idiom for, kind of hit me, bring it on, show me what you can do in jazz and blues. So maybe it would have been okay. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, they certainly in those, in any record business, I suppose the hit single was very, very important in those days. So any record company would have been clear that if this album was going to fly, it was going to need something, it was going to need wings, and that was going to be the hit songs. And so Tell All the People and Touch Me. Actually, they released a lot of singles from this record before the album came out too. So most of the songs were known to audiences by the time the album appeared.
Touch Me, Wishful Sinful, Tell All the People, and Runnin' Blue were the singles.
Yeah, Runnin' Blue is a funny song. It's hard to imagine. I mean, here they all this commercial energy into something like Touch Me, and then Runnin' Blue, which is a really uncommercial song. I think it's a terrific song. I've always really liked it. I think it's funny, and the fact that it's about Otis Redding makes it sort of, I don't know. It's sort of a kooky song that works.
I thought it was Ray Manzarek, but Robbie Krieger sharing vocals with Jim Morrison.
Yeah, Manzarek used to sing a bit, particularly if Jim couldn't or was arrested or something happened. He could do quite a good imitation of Morrison, apparently, and he was the singer in Rick and the Ravens, so he could sing. But that's Robbie doing that voice. But I think Jim's bit is great in that too. I mean, when he comes in, it just sounds, that sweeping kind of vocal just sounds fantastic.
One last thought on this album, and that is the title track, The Soft Parade, which you've already talked about, but I'm curious if you know, where does this whole part of him, Jim, in the role as a preacher, recalling a discussion in seminary school about whether or not the Lord can be petitioned with prayer, where does that come from? Is that somewhere in his past?
It isn't. I mean, I think it's kind of a voice. He as a sort of an actor, as a writer who was interested in voices, interested in telling stories, interested in different characters' voices. Somewhere he doesn't seem to have had any real sort of church upbringing other than a pretty standard one. His interest in religion was more kind of aesthetic, I think, than spiritual. He was interested in spirit and a sort of spiritual idea, and he was interested in religion. I'm going to put this carefully. He was interested in ceremonies, in the ritual of religion, maybe more so than the actual spiritual content. But somewhere in his imagination was this preacher, this old-time preacher, telling this story about this discussion from seminary school. I'm not crazy about a lot of what happens later in the Soft Parade, but I love that. I think that's so, and he does it again on the live album, and it's just, I think it's just terrific. It's so unexpected, and it's so loopy, but it's also so convincing. I mean, it really does sound like what he wants it to sound like.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Talking with Tony Thompson, whose book, The Doors' Every Album, Every Song, is out now. The Doors would prove their critics wrong with the next studio album, 1970's Morrison Hotel, was, as rock critic David Frick wrote, one of rock's great resurrection records. This album is divided into two sides. It's based on two actual establishments in Los Angeles. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, two actual places, the Hard Rock Cafe, which was a sort of a dive bar, kind of I think I called it a Bukowski dive bar. I was reading the book over yesterday, and I thought, I wonder if people know what I meant there. So Charles Bukowski was this sort of down-and-out writer who became quite famous in L.A. for his depictions of the sort of demi-monde, but so it was a sort of dive bar, and Jim loved these kind of places. So that was one side. And the other side was Morrison Hotel, which was just something that Ray Manzarek drove past one day and thought, hey, that'd be great for an album cover because there's Morrison Hotel. They had a little trouble. Henry Dillitz, the photographer, got them there. The guy on the door, the doorman, the clerk, the day guy, said, no, you can't take the photos. Just, So they had to wait until he went, he went to the toilet or he went to get some cigarettes or something. They ran in there and took the pictures and then ran back out again. But it actually, I didn't find this written anywhere, but it occurred to me that it was quite brave to call it Morrison Hotel because of what had happened, and that Jim Morrison was pretty notorious by that point. So it was sort of a kind of a more typical Elektra move to say, no, this is still Jim Morrison. This is Morrison Hotel, because I think a lot of bands might have played his role down a little bit under the circumstances.
Roadhouse Blues is a classic rock radio staple. Early versions of this song have Ray Manzarek singing. Can you talk about what Jim Morrison said about the subject of this song, Roadhouse Blues?
Yeah, actually, this has been released officially. I think you could always get it on reissues of Morrison Hotel, but Record Store Day a few months ago, they put out a double vinyl album of outtakes from Morrison Hotel, which I bought. And it's got a whole bunch of different versions of Roadhouse Blues. It's got a lot of different versions of Queen of the Highway, too, which we can talk about in a second. But Roadhouse Blues, he introduces it in this really interesting way. I put the whole thing in the book where he says, let's imagine we're driving and the radio's playing also. It's a 57 Chevy. So that's interesting because even in 1969, 70, there was already that sense of nostalgia about the late 1950s when these guys had been kids. But that nostalgia for the 50s, which began in the late 60s, and then you can see in American Graffiti and Happy Days and all of that in the 70s. But yeah, he says a 57 Chevy, and we've got some beer, and we're cruising along, and we're heading for this roadhouse. And so that's the idea of the song, that this is this sort of imaginative landscape, rock and roll landscape. However, some people say that this was based on an actual place in Topanga Canyon, which is further on north of Laurel Canyon. I hope I've got that right. And involved a very difficult and windy drive up to this place. It was called the Corral. And I think Linda Ronstadt used to play there quite regularly. And somebody recorded a live album there. It might have been Canned Heat, but this is the place that some people think this song is about, because apparently it was a really one. So when he says, keep your eyes on the road, keep your hands on the wheel. It's like Jim Morrison's safe driving tips. And there's some idea also that he had a bungalow up there, but I don't know. This is the kind of thing that gets thrown around. But it seems to be a song about he and Pamela maybe driving up to the Topanga Corral, which is the kind of place he would have loved.
How about Peace Frog? That's another great track off of this album. Got to give some love to Robbie Krieger here. What a great riff.
I think this is a fantastic song. Morrison Hotel is if I had to pick one, is my favorite Doors album. like the Beatles, like a lot of bands, there's different Doors. When people say, oh, they sound like the Doors, there's the Doors of the first two albums, and then there's the Doors of Morrison Hotel and Ellie Woman. And I suppose there's a sort of transitional Doors in there with the two middle albums. But I think Morrison Hotel is song by song, even though I recognize the brilliance of the first album and Strange Days, the Morrison Hotel really appeals to me. And things like Peace Frog, I just think, it's so imaginative, based on this killer riff. Just a wonderful, wonderful song. And also a wonderful sort of evocation of the period of 69, 68. I mean, he's talking about 68 when he talks about Chicago. But it's interesting how he then switches to New Haven, where he himself was arrested on stage. So he's sort of this kind of atmosphere of revolution, of change that he draws out. And then of course he snaps into this childhood memory of a car accident involving Native Americans.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Before we get to that, though, I got to tell you, because there's an attachment I have to this song. There was a bar that I went to college in New Haven, here in Connecticut, and there was a bar there called Josie Wales, which was like the Fog. I mean, it was like a seedy little bar, but you can get in there, had a fake ID that let you in, and they proudly displayed Jim Morrison's mugshot photo from his New Haven, Connecticut on-stage arrest. And that was in December of 67, by the way. They had it encased in glass. And he name checks it in this song along with Chicago and Venice. But the New Haven line, he sings blood on the streets in the town of New Haven. It's just great. But also there are lyrics drawn from a poem he wrote called Abortion Stories. This you write in your book. And then there's that classic interlude where he tells the famous story of when he was 4 driving through a desert in New Mexico. Can you talk about that story? It's pretty well known, but it's always worth retelling.
It's an amazing story because it's true. I mean, as far as seeing the souls and all of that kind of thing, Oliver Stone never wanted to shy away from that kind of thing. Of course, makes a very, very big deal of this story in his movie. But his parents confirmed this story. This happened. And he was very little when it happened. And so it's a very early memory, and it may be a mix of a memory and a family kind of a story they told later. But his father was in the military, so they moved around the Southwest quite a bit. And they came across a terrible car accident involving a group of Native Americans. And, there were bodies it was just one of those horror car crash, and there were bodies on the road. And very young Jim Morrison was quite affected by the sight, as of course he would be. There's a tape. It was a Palm Springs motel room. This is a tape. It's sometimes called you find it sometimes there's a bootleg that was going around called the Lost Paris tapes. I think it's a semi-bootleg. I think that's what it's on, but I could be wrong, where he told this story. This recording was then used on an American Prayer. So you can hear him telling the story the way he told it to people on an American Prayer. But yeah, it works really well in Peace Frog because I suppose what he's talking about is, I was going to try to draw some meaning from it. This is America in the late 60s, early 70s. There's a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of violence. There's the Vietnam War. There's the protests against it. There's things like Manson. There's the Black Panthers. There's all this there's this world that he's living in. And then he draws back to Native Americans and this car accident. It's something about like original sin or something like that. Like there's a lot of talk about this in Australia about the original sin of colonization. And I'm not sure that's what Jim had in mind, but that's certainly the effect, I think, by juxtaposing this memory of Native Americans killed by the side of the road and the upheaval of the late 60s and 70s. I think that's a really interesting song, and I love it.
And after the release of Absolutely Live in 1970, the Doors followed up with what would be their last studio album with Jim Morrison, Ellie Woman. Released in April of 1971, it was recorded in December and January of 71 at the Doors workshop on 8512 Santa Monica Boulevard. Jim famously sings the vocals from the studio's bathroom to get just the right sound. Only days before they went into the studio, they played what would be their last ever show, the Warehouse in New Orleans. Now, this one would be without their producer, Paul Rothschild. he backs out early on, right? He hears the music the band presents, doesn't like what he hears.
Yeah, the story of Ellie Woman is a really interesting one. A little bit unparalleled, I think, in rock and roll. I mean, it's not too many bands that produce a final record that rivals their first record, their first hit record. I mean, it's not. To me, I don't know if I said this in the book, but I was certainly thinking it, that something like, for last albums for great bands, it's usually more like something like In Through the Outdoor, like it was a great album by Led Zeppelin, but it's not as great as like, I think it doesn't quite have the same impact as Four or, Led Zeppelin 2. But so it tends to be an album where things have come apart. Now, sometimes that turns into gold, like Abbey Road, of course, but they're always the exception to the rule. LA Woman, boy, was it a bad period. I mean, Morrison really was really lost at this point, and it looked like he was going to go to jail. I mean, he was going to go to jail, but there was immediately an appeal, so he got out again. But he was looking at I think he was looking at 10 months or maybe a year of hard labor. It's like Oscar Wilde or something. I mean, imagine Jim Morrison in prison for a year in Florida doing hard labor in the condition he was in. The band had stopped playing live. One of the interesting things about this album, of course, is that very few of the songs were ever done live. And you can hear versions of, I think, Riders in the Storm and Love Her Madly, possibly. You can hear live versions of those. They're pretty hard to hear, but they played 3 gigs in the States after playing in England, and that was it. After they'd played the Isle of Man Festival, they came back and they played a couple of shows in the South, and their final show was in New Orleans. And at the Warehouse Bar, which was that's where the Grateful Dead played when they got busted, in the song, busted in New Orleans and all that stuff. So this was a legendary venue at the time. But apparently Manzarek fairly dramatically said that he watched Jim Soul kind of, leave his body during the show. And the recordings are chaotic, of course. And Densmore said, that's it. I'm not playing on stage with that guy again. It's too much. So they decided not to tour anymore. Nobody knew Jim was going to die. So, obviously they were seeing the future very differently to what we know was coming. But they went to LA and somehow managed to record an incredibly strong record, considering that things had got just about as bad as they could get, and his drinking was so out of control, and apparently his cocaine use had become another problem. He was not in good shape. So it's really amazing because these are great songs, but Paul Rothchild, I think, had found Morrison increasingly hard to deal with. He'd seen for a long time, he'd recognized that this was a really significant singer and somebody who had a huge amount of potential. But I think by the time LA Women came along, what had happened was Rothchild had produced Pearl by Janis Joplin. And that had been, from all accounts, a remarkable experience for everybody involved, and had come up with this, this glorious record and all these great songs. And he'd really loved working with Janis, and he thought she'd been fantastic. She'd been in pretty good shape throughout the making of this, and then died before it was released. And apparently Rothchild was devastated. So for him then to turn around and listen to the Doors play their stuff, Jim Morrison obviously in terrible shape, I think it was too much. I mean, to give the guys to be sympathetic, it must have been, that must have been a very, very difficult period for him. He was very close to Janis, and maybe, he just wasn't interested in watching it happen again, which of course it did. So he wasn't wrong. But he apparently listened to, there's a few different accounts. He listened to Love Her Madly and he called it cocktail music and stormed out. Some people say it was Riders on the Storm, which is pretty hard to believe. And I don't think it was written yet. So I think it was probably Love Her Madly. But also he felt like the band just wasn't prepared. Like they just weren't rehearsed enough to start recording. So he turned it over to Bruce Botnick, who did a fantastic job. Really, it sounds great, this record.
Who, by the way, was the engineer on all of the Doors albums?
Yeah, he went right back. He's the engineer. He's on all kinds of stuff for Elektra. It's amazing the records that he engineered, and as far as I know, is still around. which is great. So still going.
Boy, there's an interview get, right? Love to tap into his mind as to what he saw in those studios.
Funny that everybody else has written a book. It's funny that he hasn't. He did a great job on this record, and such a brainwave taking them out of the studio where Jim probably wasn't entirely comfortable anymore, and there would have been a lot of memories associated with it, and just put them in a casual environment where they were comfortable. And Jim he did some writing. He sang. His voice had changed a little bit by this point, as a lot of people have noted, but boy, he sounds great. And of course, he came up with Riders on the Storm, which is an Ellie Woman. And
that might be my favorite all-time Doors track, Riders on the Storm.
Riders on the Storm is just the definition of a sort of atmospheric rock and roll song. It's mysterious, and it's evocative, and it's dark, and yeah, just a wonderful. And it's the last, apparently, I hope this is true, it was the last thing he ever recorded with the band.
His whispered vocals, the whispering.
Whispering vocals, which may have been dubbed in, but yeah, that's it for him. Because the lyrics are very, as I said in the book, they seem to be inspired by Heidegger's idea of thrownness, which is the sort of a proto-existential idea of we are where we are kind of land in the world and in context, and it's the imagery is so wonderful of the actor out on loan, which is a very, very Hollywood idea where actors who were under contract, very strict contracts from the studios, were sometimes loaned to other studios. And that lack of sort of agency, that you're an actor out on loan, or a dog without a bone, sort of looking for something, really, really builds the image of this sort of existential view of life in that song.
You talked about the bluesy music they were making. Lover Madly was a different version. You said it was a more bluesy version the band performed that Paul Rothschild may have heard, maybe not.
Yeah, I think probably it may have been what he heard them play. And it may have been, if you listen to a show they did in Texas, I think it's in the book, I mentioned this, it might have been in Dallas. They played two shows, a matinee and an evening show before the famous final New Orleans show, where they do Love Her Madly. And yeah, it's a much more bluesy version of the song. And that may have been what he heard, yeah, because the final one is great. It's a totally different sort of arrangement, and it speeds it up, and it's goes back to almost sort of Latin rhythms. It has a real groove, I suppose, beyond the sort of 12-bar blues kind of thing.
A near top 10 single. The title track is another FM rock radio classic. Robbie and Ray have said this is the band at its best. Interesting that the bass playing on this track and the album as a whole stands out. That comes from Jerry Sheff, who played with Elvis Presley. We talked about the Doors being a band without a bass player, but they did have bass players contribute in the studio over the years. There were altogether about 20 bass players altogether. Is Jerry Sheff the biggest, I guess, is he the standout among all of the bass players?
From my perspective, he's certainly the best bass player ever to play with them. I mean, they had a whole bunch of people who were really good. Ray Neapolitan, who was a kind of jobbing musician at the time, played on a lot of their stuff. Doug Lubin from Clearlight. Harvey Brooks, who's a kind of another jobbing musician, is here and there, and Lonnie Brooks, who had been an R&B, had a bit of an R&B star moment just before the Beatles turned up, and was recording on Elektra by that point. He plays bass on Roadhouse Blues, actually. So he was a guitar player, but they put him on bass for the song. So, but I think Jerry Sheff he is just so good, and the bass work on Ellie Woman is just. But he was a really experienced. He's on all kinds of stuff. I think he's on Bridge Over Troubled Water, though he may be playing piano on that song or something like that. But yeah, you see his name comes up over and over again on credits, and of course with Elvis, he was in Elvis's band. The other thing on Ellie Woman is there's a guy called Mark Beno playing guitar. It's the only time they added a second guitar player. Mark Beno had been in a band with Leon Russell, and would go on to do a few of his own albums, one called Ambush, which is really worth tracking down. Really, really terrific record.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The title track, Ellie Woman. In the song, Jim sings Mr. Mojo Rising. Who is Mr. Mojo Rising?
It's an anagram for Jim Morrison, of course.
And this is interesting because the story is that Jim Morrison told Ray Manzarek once that if he ever gets a call from someone by the name of Mr. Mojo Rising from Africa, that is actually Jim Morrison. And the idea would be that Jim faked his death.
Yeah, that's right. So Africa, of course, probably has something to do with the French symbolist poet Arthur Rimbaud, who Morrison was a big fan of. Patti Smith's fanatical about him and often talks about the two of them together. But Rimbaud went to Africa and spent a lot of time there and lost a leg there. This is in the 19th century, and then came back. And so Jim sort of imagined this kind of like taking off like Rimbaud and reinventing himself. This is just my theory. The idea that he hinted about, and I suppose they were living in a time where Janis had died, Jimmy had died, Otis had died. Rock stars were dying, and Jim, he must have thought, well, the life I'm leading, anything could happen. I don't, obviously Ray slightly mischievously would sometimes in interviews say, well, there's a lot more to the story than you might think. Things like that. It would drive John Densmore nuts. Like John Densmore, like, the man is dead, and don't try to pretend that he's going to come back from Africa sometime. It's it's not respectful, but yeah, it's a great story. It's a great idea.
Have you heard about the one that he lives in Oregon? That he moved to Oregon? Yeah. Because in my back of my radio days, I was doing a night show, and there was a guy who had a website. I think he was charging money. You'd have to pay, I think, to make the call to this guy, and he could tell you all about Jim. Oh yeah, he's in town here. I talked to him on the air, and this guy was trying to convince you that Jim Morrison was living out there in Oregon. Why Oregon? I don't know, but there are pictures online of the supposed Jim Morrison. Yeah.
Is that the guy that was a sort of a street person? I've seen these photos, I think, of this guy. He does look a bit like Jim, who's, but I don't think it's him. But you can imagine that, somebody might have thought, oh, we can make something of this poor guy. I think those photos are around online, if that's the same one.
I think, yeah. People don't want to let go. They don't want to believe that their hero is gone.
The story, Jim Morrison's, I don't want to get into Jim Morrison lore, but because he did apparently overdose on heroin at a bar, and then was taken back to try to revive him, and also to take the heat off a bar that was a place where people quite big dealing took place. And then it was a heart attack. They said he'd had a heart attack. So it was a you can see where the seeds of trouble started. And then he was buried really quickly, and there was no autopsy. And the band's manager flew quickly to Paris, but never saw the body. So there, this is the kind of thing that breeds the sort of those sort of theories.
Well, the story is that they found him with his head up against the faucet part of the tub, which then the conspiracy theorists will say, well, how is that even possible? Why would he be lying on that side? And the conspiracy being that there was more than one person involved here, and they all got together and said, for whatever reason, I don't want to get caught because I gave him the drugs, whatever it is, but they propped him up in there. Look, Jim dealt with being famous while he was alive, and even in death, he was dealing with all that wacky stuff that he just couldn't deal with. But I want to go back to Riders on the Storm just one more time before we wrap up this album. This is fascinating in terms of what the lyrics are about. Sonically, it started off as an old Western standard, I believe, but there's also a poem that inspired the song title.
Apparently it did. It started with a jam of Ghost Riders in the Sky, which is a part of the absolute kind of rock solid classic of the Western genre as opposed to the country genre. And it's a great sort of minory kind of, mystical cowboy song, and so they were jamming on it, and somehow it grew into Riders on the Storm. Now, there's a poem by Hart Crane, American poet, about the death of a friend, where he talks about Riders on the Storm. And there's been some speculation that Jim knew poetry very well, and he read a lot of it. And he had a great memory, and it may have just been a phrase that lingered in his head, which is interesting, of course, because it's about death. So what was he thinking about? And certainly on this album, there's a lot of goodbyes on this album. I don't think Jim thought he was going to die necessarily, but I think he realized that he was about to leave America and that he probably wasn't going to come back, because they apparently told him that at his next hearing, he was going to have to turn over his passport. And it's amazing when you think of it, that he just went to the airport, LAX, got on a plane to Paris when he was in the middle of an appeal, when he was appealing a prison sentence. And nobody stopped him. This is before computers, before, that, but there was some idea that he felt like he was leaving the state. So there's a bit of a farewell to LA, farewell to America, farewell to everything on this record. But Riders on the Storm is, of course, this very dark meditation on life and what it all means. So Beautiful. It makes for a very haunting finish to the Doors, to Jim Morrison's career.
After Jim's death on July 3rd, 1971, the Doors would release 3 more studio albums. Well, really 2, and then a kind of sort of studio album, but 1971's Other Voices, 1972's Full Circle, and in 1978 they released An American Prayer, which featured audio of Jim reading his poetry. Other Voices and Full Circle are often forgotten records. Those 2 were an attempt by the band to move on as a 3-piece. An American Prayer took the spoken word recordings from Jim, as I said. Anything that stands out from those 3, particularly those 2 that came after Jim's passing, they really don't, they're forgotten. Is there anything good from either of those 2 albums? Ray Manzarek sings all the vocals, I'm assuming, lead vocals on those?
Krieger actually sings quite a bit.
Krieger sings quite a bit, okay.
I think the thing is that they're misguided, the albums. Unfortunately, you can see glimpses of what might have been and what might have worked a lot better. But again, it was listening to these albums a lot that I thought, wow, Jim had a much bigger influence on the Doors than he's often given credit for. There's sort of this idea that he had these 3 musicians and this drunken poet guy who turned up sometimes and sang these amazing lyrics. But something about the whole atmosphere of the records, obviously without Jim was always going to be difficult without his voice, but just in terms of the kind of music they did and what they were trying to do, I find these records really strange. Other Voices is often people will say, well, Other Voices was pretty bad, but Full Circle's terrible. Actually, it's the other way around. Other Voices, it's not awful, but it's pretty hard going. It's pretty undistinguished. I think that's more the point. There's a lot of kind of, I don't know, vaguely sort of country rock kind of Krieger songs, and with not very distinguished lyrics, not very interesting lyrics. But there's a couple of moments on both these records. On Other Voices, there's a song called Ship with Sails, where what you hear is the band doing what they do best, which is stretching out and into a kind of a jazz. They'd always threatened jazz. They'd always talked a lot about jazz in interviews. And Ships with Sails, even though the singing in it is probably, it would have been better as an instrumental, but it's the one song where you think, wow, I could really hear Morrison here. If he'd sung on this, would have been great.
They were written for him in mind, weren't they? Other Voices, those songs.
Yeah, and at least some of Other Voices must have been, just by the timing. It was hard to find too much information about this, but they were talking to him on the phone about what they were doing while he was in Paris. And there were letters back and forth. And Jim, apparently, the last conversation he had with Densmore, he was saying, well, how's Ellie Woman doing? And, and asking about what they were working on. I don't know how it would have all played out with the Florida arrest warrant if he hadn't turned up. But the thing was, they did seem to anticipate another album with Jim. So but it's a little bit hard to work out which songs they had in mind. But this Ships with Sails, I think people can go and listen to it from themselves. Sounds like it might have been one of the ones they had in mind, and it's really good by any standards. It's a great song. The other interesting one on there is Tightrope Ride, which I have a feeling Ray Manzarek might have written in about 1965, because that's what it sounds like. It's just this great garage punk burner. It was the single, and it's really worth hearing. It's great in a kind of 1966 kind of way, 1965 sort of way. Those were probably the two best moments on the record. It's just not the Doors, I suppose, without Morrison. I suppose it's the sad thing. It's something, and what might have been great might have been for them to have kind of regrouped, thought about, not about getting a replacement, but maybe reconfiguring the band. And you can see moments where they might have gone in that direction. On Full Circle, there's a song called Verdalic, where they get Charles Lloyd, who was a jazz sax player, pretty avant-garde player, played flute as well, really good. And that's a great song. Boy, that's the best post, for my money, the best post-Jim thing they did. That's on Full Circle. So that's really worth hearing. If they'd gone in that direction, kind of gone into a sort of jazz rock, prog sort of jam kind of thing, and maybe looked for a different sort of vocalist to come in, it might have worked. I mean, they might have been able to do something, but they seem to get stuck in this idea of coming up with another single, and Krieger's songs, I think without Jim Morrison in mind, maybe seem to lose something. It's like watching Get Back and the Beatles. I think they were tired, and I think they'd been through a lot. They were still young men, and I think the trauma of losing Jim and the what must have been a very exhausting few years was weighing on them by the time they made those records. The weirdest song in the entire Doors catalog is on Full Circle. That's called Mosquito, which has some Spanish lyrics about a mosquito and somebody eating a burrito. The instrumental part is kind of it's got a bit of a groove, but that's a very strange song. And if you get the singles album, you end up with Mosquito at some point. Apparently, according to Robbie Krieger, it was their biggest hit outside of non-English speaking countries. I don't know. So he says.
And they finished with 1978's An American Prayer, the ninth and final studio album by the Doors. Surviving members reconvene to set several of Jim's spoken word recordings to music. What do you think about this album, An American Prayer?
If you listen to that album as a kind of documentary, which is what it is, what they were trying to do was tell a story about how Joe's poetic impulses translated into the songs. So what you get on that album are recordings from two readings that he did in 69 and 70, just on his own, where he went into a studio and he read from his notebooks. What they did was take bits and pieces of that which related to songs, and they tried to show the process of the songs. Plus there's other stuff that's just good sounding stuff, which then they put music behind. They recorded some new material. They used some old material. I think it's a really interesting record, and I think for Jim who wanted to do a spoken word album, it's a really nice way to, a nice sort of tribute to Jim as a poet, which he was. He did write poetry. He loved poetry. He was interested in language and storytelling. So, yeah.
So let's rank the 6 studio albums, talking about the ones that they recorded while Jim was alive. I got the first album at 1, Strange Days at 2, Ellie Woman at 3, Waiting for the Sun at 4, Morrison Hotel at 5, Soft Parade at 6. As you can tell, I lean more towards the psychedelic Doors than the bluesy Doors. So my list is early album top heavy. What would you go with for your 6?
My tastes go probably the other way. So for me, and this is really off the top of my head, but Morrison Hotel is number 1 for me. Ellie Woman is number 2. I'm really taken with those 2 records. The first album is number 3. Depending on when you ask me, it's number 3. Strange Days, number 4. Waiting for the Sun, number 5. And then Soft Parade is number 6 for me. there was a compilation called Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine that came out in the early 70s. And really my first serious exposure to the Doors was through that album. My mom gave it to me for my birthday when I was 14, which was probably a bit ill-advised, but it was very much, it's worth having a look at the songs that they did, because it's very much the Jim Morrison Doors, and it leans pretty heavily on the late, not exclusively, but it leans pretty heavily on the later period, and it doesn't have Light My Fire or Hello, I Love You on it. So it's a really kind of nuanced version of the Doors, but that was my Doors. So things like The Wasp from Ellie Woman, that's a real favorite of mine.
Classic tune.
And Peace Frog, and so yeah, that's why I think mine's a bit heavy. It leans a little bit to the later Doors.
One last question before I let you go, Tony. If Jim Morrison were to have lived beyond 27 years, what would the Doors have become in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond?
It's a very good question. I think there's a couple of possibilities, and there's some hints, I suppose, on the two records that not that they would have been anything like they were, the two records with Jim on board, but I think the Doors would have been quite a natural fit for prog rock. Not that they were a prog band, but I think they probably would have found a niche within a kind of expanding sound of the early 70s. So it may be that they would have actually made the transition to the 1970s quite easily, and in fact, really, they have to be an influence on prog. This is even the existence of American progressive rock is a late night argument, but they must have been an influence. And I have wondered if they would have kind of embraced that or been allowed to embrace that, maybe on a different label, a different major label. I'm not sure. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, there's a song on the live album called The Universal Mind that they did not, as far as I can remember, ever record in the studio. But it's a funny song, and for me, it sounds a little bit like a lost Leonard Cohen song. You don't think of Jim and Leonard Cohen in the same universe all that often, but this is a little bit of crossover. Not that I think it was inspired by Leonard, but it's got the same kind of humor and sort of personality as some of Leonard Cohen's slightly maybe lighter songs. And I have wondered if Jim would have done, if there's any possibility that Jim as a songwriter and so focused on lyrics would have done a solo record, maybe in this sort of singer-songwriter mode. So there's a tantalizing possibility, because that was the other thing that was happening in the early 70s. If someone, somebody like David Geffen would say, look, you've got these great lyrics. Let me put together with a different sort of band, and you've got a great voice, and you sing some of your songs. You sing some, and we put the focus on the lyrics and the songs. I don't know. That would have been interesting.
The decade that's most intriguing is the 80s. Trying to imagine the Doors in the 80s during that whole synth pop era and bands like Flock of Seagulls and MTV.
Yeah. It wouldn't, like a lot of people, it would have been a tough decade for them, I think, anyway. It's funny how much of an influence they were, though. I remember as a high school kid, I was my tastes were always very much in the past, the 60s. And I had some interest in punk, and a lot of my friends were into punk and new wave and that kind of thing. And I remember a guy called Alex taking his Sony Walkman headphones and saying, you got to listen to this. It's got guitars, you'll like it. And it was echoing the Bunnymen, do it clean or something like that. And I said, this just sounds like the Doors.
Yeah.
And I was right, but it took everybody a long time to acknowledge the Doors' influence on a certain type of kind of dark romantic guitar rock of the 80s. There's an Australian band who I revere called the Triffids, and the Doors' influence, if anybody's interested, go and listen to a track from their first album called Hell of a Summer. And the influence of the Doors, it's pronounced. It's not subtle. And of course, Echo and the Bunnymen did People Are Strange for the Lost Boys soundtrack. It's not only a cover of the song, but it's a tribute to the Doors, because it's got this big organ solo, which is not on the Doors version. And it's a bit of a nod to an important influence.
Well, The Doors, every album, every song, it's out now. It came out late October. It's out through Sonic Bond Publishing, and it's available wherever books are sold. Any websites you want to direct people to get a copy of this, Tony? I know Sonic Bond. I can always put the link up to Sonic Bond's website or Burning Shed, I believe.
Burning Shed. I think that's probably the best place to go for. It's available on Amazon as well.
All right, Tony, thanks so much for being on. It was great talking Doors with you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. Really nice to meet you, and thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks again to Tony Thompson for taking us through his book, The Doors, Every Album, Every Song. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Tony, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on this episode's show notes page or through our website, bookedonrock.com. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrock podcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.